Hello there, I'm Geraldine Doog. Welcome to Compass, which is on a bit of a quest this week, a personal quest of mine after my visit to Jerusalem, to sort out something pretty important about my Catholic Christian faith. Do I really understand its Jewish roots? After all, Jesus, his mother Mary, the saints Peter and Paul, they were all Orthodox practising Jews till the day they each died. Ignore the Jewishness of Jesus and you miss a lot about his real message. That's a growing sense inside the church. So tonight, we meet some of the people trying to understand more. During my recent visit to Jerusalem, I celebrated with other Catholics the age-old ritual of the Mass, or the Eucharist, where we express as Christians our faith in Jesus Christ. I also joined the crowds on the Via Dolorosa, the traditional route which Jesus travelled on the day of his crucifixion. But as I explored the archaeology and the traditions and context in which Jesus lived, I found myself asking questions about how the Jewish roots of Christianity might inform my own faith.
I think for the Christian it's very important to be able to see Jesus clearly, to try and put him really into focus. And as a Jew of his time, the more we know about the Judaism of his time, the Judaism of Galilee, the more clearly we can see him.
And if you go back looking through the roots of Christianity, you come back to Jesus, who was a very good practising Jew.
I mean, it's a platitude to say Jesus was a Jew. But once you say that and really understand what it means, then it has all kinds of implications.
So how do these two supposedly very different beliefs, Judaism and Christianity, overlap? To find out where my fascination with this began requires a journey into the past. Growing up here in South Perth, I was embedded in a strong Irish Catholic tribe, and I was very conscious of other Christian groups. But I had wonderful next-door neighbours, very different from your average Aussie family. They were German Jews, and I was fascinated by them. The Weisenbergs had escaped Nazi Germany and arrived in Australia just 2 weeks before war broke out in 1939. They changed their name to Wise and settled down to make a new life in South Perth.
Hello, hello. Oh, terrific.
Their children, Ron and Evie, still live in Perth, and I'm catching up with them after a very long time. My recollection is that your parents had come from this very sophisticated world of Germany. Truly, I did think this. And it's only later that I thought, wow, what a tremendous adaptation they had to go through.
Oh, they did miss having extended family. They missed, of course, that sense of belongingness and having, but then embraced what it did have to offer.
And I'm so thrilled you've been able to find some pictures, because this is Ruth. She was so stylish, your mother.
Yeah.
I always remember that so vividly. Isn't that a fabulous shot with that hat?
That was still in Germany.
That's what, about 33 or 34 or something, is it? 1933.
Yep.
Yeah.
And this is Rudy from the time, my goodness.
With his Great Dane Prince.
Giant dog. Very old, very sort of stylish man of the old world, isn't he? So did your father have anything to do, Ron, with setting up a sort of Jewish Australian community post-war?
Mum and Dad were founders of the Temple David, the liberal Jewish congregation. There's still a room there that with our grandparents' name on it that they've put in there.
Yes, I must say I remember your family, every now and again your mother, especially as I got older, she would invite me in for a sort of nice conversation. And she'd, serve me a lovely drink and some cake. I actually did feel I was being invited into a slightly different world. That's the truth of it. My visit to the Wises brought back fond memories of what I saw, as their very successful integration. But it did make me think more about where the prejudice and suspicion that Jews are often subjected to comes from. Was it fanned by the Bible stories I listened to every Holy Week at St Columba's Church about how the Jews killed Jesus? John's Gospel tells us that the Jews brought Jesus before Pilate to be condemned.
And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar."
It's been argued that it's these New Testament passages that sowed the seeds of discrimination and anti-Semitism that wrought havoc for centuries.
The tragedy of alienation that came to its apogee in the Holocaust, you are looking at something which is profoundly tragic, and that sense of the Jew as the other who is to be eliminated, rather than the sense of the Jew as the other who is me, who is my other. So trying to reimagine, re-articulate the relationship between Judaism and Christianity has been one of the crucial tasks ever since the end of the Second World War, and it's far from finished.
As I was happily navigating the rituals of my Catholic faith, like First Communion and Confirmation, extraordinary events were taking place in Rome that would shake the very foundations of my church. Between 1962 and 65, the world's Catholic leaders met in Rome. Called the Second Vatican Council, this historic gathering introduced sweeping changes that modernised the Catholic Church. Among those changes was Nostra Aetate, Latin for in our time. Now, this document revolutionised the Catholic Church's approach to Jews and Judaism after almost 2,000 years of pain and sorrow. Nostra Aetate emphasised the ties that bind the two peoples and rejected any collective responsibility then or now for Jesus' death, especially decrying anti-Semitism. It was an historic breakthrough after a long and sad history of misunderstanding and persecution.
Nostra Aetate was very significant because here was the Catholic Church in its most solemn gathering, standing up and saying, enough. A new kind of relationship has to be conceived and enacted. In one sense, it's the beginning of a very long task, and a task that's long because its prehistory is long and agonised.
This is my body, which will be given up for you.
For Catholics sitting in the pews, Nostra Aetate offered a brand new way of seeing other faiths, especially Judaism. And looking back, it's one of the documents of the century. But at the time, it didn't really cut through here in Australia. That took years and a certain papal commitment. Since the 1960s, successive popes have enthusiastically improved relations and friendship with the Jewish people. But it was Pope John Paul II's visit to the Great Synagogue in Rome in 1986 that really broke the ice. The first pope to visit a Jewish synagogue, his gesture was highly significant.
That was the brilliance of the understanding of John Paul II, who intuitively realised that in going to the synagogue, he was doing more for Catholic-Jewish relations, for Christian-Jewish relations, than ever since the whole revolution began with Nostra Aetate and John XXIII.
The symbolic import of him going to the synagogue in Rome was enormous. I mean, here was Roman Christianity was in many ways born from the synagogue. It was a very Jewish form of Christianity from the beginning. But here, for the first time, the leader of Roman Christianity, the Pope, was entering the synagogue. It was like Roman Christianity coming home.
Stepping off the plane in Israel, the 79-year-old pontiff expressed his deep emotion at finally visiting God's chosen land.
And in the year 2000, the Pope again made history by visiting Israel and praying at the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism.
The trembling hand putting the prayer into the Western Wall, I found profoundly moving because it was more powerful than the vigorous young Pope to see the frail old Pope. Again, he seemed to be bearing many of the burdens of historic Christianity and just placing, and I know the text of the prayer was a prayer about the past that he placed in the Western Wall. Those sorts of symbolic gestures, most recently Pope Francis was there too. It's hard to overstate their significance.
To see him stand at the Kotel at the Western Wall, asking God's forgiveness for all the sins committed against Jews, down the generations, that blew Jewish Israelis' minds.
This new relationship with Judaism has also brought a deeper grasp of how Christians understand their Jewish heritage. That Jesus, his mother Mary and the apostles were all practicing Jews.
If you don't know Judaism, you don't really know Jesus. You don't know the apostles. You don't know the world at that time. You read your New Testament and you think there's an argument between some people who are Christians and some people who are Jews. And you don't understand that they're all Jews in an internal debate as reflected the period of the time. And therefore your whole reading of your text, of your Bible, is distorted if you don't understand the Jewish context in which it's being read.
It's now been over 50 years since Vatican II started to build the bridges between Christianity and Judaism. But having an appreciation of Judaism still stands as a challenge to many Christians.
What does it give a practicing Catholic in Australia, for the sake of argument, if they do know this more? How would it change their lives?
The Christian is called to live as an imitator of Christ. This is the message. To live as Christ lived, to speak as he speaks, to walk as he walked, to love as he loves. And the more we get to know him, the better, the clearer we can see him, the better we can live our Christian lives. And Jews and Judaism are a key to that knowledge of Jesus.
So what new understandings could Christians gain from Judaism? Would it harm their faith to restore Jesus to his Jewish roots? I've been invited to a Friday night Shabbat in Sydney, which begins the Sabbath, which must be observed as a holy day of rest. For Jews, it's an opportunity to pause, to emphasise culture and meaning, surrounded by family and friends.
So, I mean, is this equivalent to what Jesus would have experienced back in Jerusalem? Not this food, but this ritual?
I would assume that it would be very, very similar. The lighting of candles and the making of kiddush, the blessing over the wine, and establishing this sanctity in the moment of Shabbat, let alone then the conversation. I mean, they talk about, when three people get together at a table, Torah must be taught and spoken about.
I think obviously in terms of the essence and the rituals, this is the case, that there is some continuity, but we have to remember that Second Temple Judaism, which is the time that Jesus lives, is an incredibly diverse period in Jewish history. And the amount of Jewish sects that are fighting amongst themselves is extraordinary. And they're coming up with different answers to the same problem, really, which is how do we achieve salvation? Where do we go to from here, in a sense? And in some ways, that's why your question about the Jewish roots is even more fascinating, because, of course, the early Christians just come up with a different answer, right? They come up with a different answer to the same question.
What I don't really understand is it's both religious and sociable, isn't it? So, like, we're now into the sociability part, are we?
Well, I don't know that there's much in Judaism that it's always mixed up.
We would make a distinction either.
Yeah.
I think there are moments and certainly traditions that focus on the more introspective and the more contemplative, but I think that's a focus that's more on the individual relationship with God, where ritual by definition in our tradition is communal. And so as soon as you add that communal element, as soon as you add that social element, it's going to feel more social, and it's going to feel less sort of solemn and more interactive.
But it also is the case, though, if you go anywhere in the world, one of the things is if you go to a synagogue somewhere on the other side of the world, no one will know you, but guaranteed you'll get an invitation to come to Shabbat dinner that night. And then strangers are not strangers anymore.
So it's hospitality,
That's right.
Which is a key obligation.
Right. It's this Jewish sense of community that makes the Friday Shabbat such a gem. And I wonder what Christians could take from this ancient tradition that Jesus and his disciples would have experienced.
My generation of Catholics in Australia, we grew up with the New Testament, but the Old Testament was somehow irrelevant. What I came to see, and what the church saw really from the very beginning, was that you can't even begin to understand Jesus in the New Testament unless you understand that there's one Bible, that the Old Testament doesn't mean to say it's a clapped-out testament, that it might be called old or former, but it is still, in the most intense way, the communication of God here and now.
The process that God put into practice.
In a meeting room on Sydney's North Shore, Catholics meet to study Judaism and to deepen their understanding of the Jewish scriptures.
Through the 40 years in the wilderness was part of the divine plan. The divine plan was
called the Light of Torah. This group's exploring the Jewish interpretation of the Old Testament, not just as the grandfather religion of Christianity, but as an authentic living faith with which they have much in common.
But where I suppose it becomes significant is...
The course founder and convener is Teresa Parola, who became passionate about the Christian connection to Judaism following a study tour of Jerusalem in 2007.
Where we see the
So it's just trying to awaken to the fact that there is this enormous storehouse of wisdom from which we Christians can also benefit, and it can enrich our Bible reading.
And God spoke all of these words, saying,
And having Rabbi Krebs guide us is wonderful, because we're not just reading books, we're actually hearing it from a Jewish person who lives his tradition, and that comes through in his teaching.
Know that he stops in Beersheba, which is halfway down Israel.
To understand a lot of the references in the New Testament, what they really do mean, it opens up a new world of reflection too. It's that midrashic method, that way of playing with scriptures, playful, but it can get serious in terms of the reflection where you can take it from there.
I think it's been extremely transforming for me as a Catholic. And it's certainly, these Jewish influences have become part of my life. So it's very normal for me now to, for part of my prayer life, I pray in Hebrew, for example.
You pray in Hebrew?
Well, yeah, there's something beautiful about the language. There's something about that which, is deeply nourishing as I pray. I read the Torah regularly with Jewish insights. I would attend synagogue at times.
Right.
Well, of course, attending Mass every Sunday, but I should add here, I'm not keeping Jewish law, I'm not, trying to be a Jew, but what I'm saying is these influences are part of the fabric of my Catholic life.
For some, studying Judaism from the outside has led them to go one step further. In Melbourne, the Colette Nitzan Synagogue in Caulfield has a new convert. Evan Thornley is a high-profile business and social entrepreneur who made his fortune during the dot-com boom of the 1990s and went on to consolidate his success with a number of local and international companies. Evan, what was the tipping point that made you think about conversion?
Oh, look, there was a lot of milestones along the journey, but I think that, I was very involved in the Jewish community and had a lot of Jewish friends. I'd been to Israel many times. I'd read a lot of Jewish history and Jewish philosophy. But when I actually started reading some Jewish theology and understanding the actual basis of Jewish belief, the thing that shocked me, I think, was that the Jewish conception of God was something that is vast and unknowable and yet residing within us and between us. In Christianity, through the person of Jesus, reducing God to human scale was always complicating for me. So I think that was probably my major turning point, was realising that the Jewish conception of God much more mirrored my own belief and experience.
Is it a heart or a head thing?
Oh, definitely both. And Judaism is such a complete way of life, it marries all of those. I think belong is of the heart. Well, I don't know, the head, I mean, I just adore the depth of intellectual tradition in Judaism. It's such an extraordinarily deep, it's an endlessly deep pool that you can dive down as far as you want and never find the bottom. I meant to hold the food in my hand when I say it.
There's various. Since his conversion, Evan Thornley's adopted the Hebrew name of Lev Yonatan. He's found a way of life that combines belief and belonging to a faith community, a perfect fit.
Do you feel Jewish now?
I do, but, you know, it's a journey. I mean, I think we often say converts, we're baby Jews. You know, I'm still 12 and a half years away from my bar mitzvah. You know, Judaism is a complete way of life, and it's not something you can pick up in half an hour. I feel much, much closer to my conception of God now than I ever have. And maybe that's probably the simplest explanation of why Judaism has worked for me. It's made a sense of the divine in my life a much more real thing. But you don't get that out of believing, you get that out of experience.
Central to Christian belief is that Jesus is the Messiah and the channel for salvation, as foretold in the Hebrew Scriptures. So, who do Jews understand the Messiah to be?
The concept of a Messiah in Jewish tradition, in other words in biblical tradition, simply means a human being who is anointed for a task. And the individual who would rule at that time was known as the Mashiach, the Messiah, the anointed one. And it's a classic example of where we have shared sources, even words, where we mean totally different things. And that's part of the problem and the opportunity and the challenge in terms of the Christian-Jewish dialogue, discovering those terms and understanding them. What do they mean to you? And the term Messiah means a very different thing to a Christian than it does to a Jew.
There are a number of Jewish teachings that talk about what will happen when the Messiah comes or when that messianic age arrives, and none of those things happened as a result of Jesus' presence on the earth. But I also don't understand the Messiah as a physical person. I see it more as a messianic age, a time that we look towards where there will be that harmony and peace on earth, where there will be, you know, the lion lying with the lamb, and, you know, that sort of that idea of wholeness and harmony and oneness.
Early Christianity ceased to be a Jewish sect when it gave up observing Jewish practices. Central to understanding the split is the Apostle St. Paul. He preached the gospel throughout the first century world, and his influence has arguably been more significant than any other New Testament author.
Let us remember that it is most likely that there was no separation until a long time afterwards, decades, if not centuries afterwards, can we speak clearly of two entities, Judaism and Christianity, with a strong sense of division between the two. At the time of the early church, Paul, Matthew, John probably had a sense that this was what Judaism was supposed to be. Messianic Judaism, the Judaism that recognized in Christ the promise of God.
The thing about Paul that we need to understand is that he never abandoned his Jewish identity.
We know that, do we?
Okay. Well, I think I do from my study of Paul and my teaching of Paul. The question for Paul was not what to do about Jews who became Christians. They just continued along the path that they had continued to take.
So they went to both synagogue and had taught Holy Communion.
That was decidedly possible, and that happened in the years before AD 70. It changes after that. But the question for Paul was, what do you do with Gentiles who become Christians? Do they have to become Jews in order to become Christians? He comes to the insight, he believed revealed by God, that Gentiles who become Christians don't have to become Jews. You don't have to walk through the door of the synagogue into the church. You can go straight into the church through what Paul calls the door of faith.
Part of the reason why this idea appealed and Paul was so successful in conquering the civilized world at the time was precisely this brilliant combination of Hebrew messages that were attractive without all the burdens and the restrictions, together with a theology that resonated from a certain broader Greek world. And he made this, he absorbed, internalized, personified, communicated this integration of ideas in a way that was brilliantly marketable.
With Paul's brilliance for reinvention, the Jesus sect evolved into the hugely successful Christianity, leaving its Jewish origins behind and taking its message of salvation based on faith to the far corners of the known world.
We focus on the figure of Jesus Christ in the way that Judaism focuses on the Torah, as that which essentially mediates the presence and the power of God to the human race. I felt the power of Judaism, the beauty of Judaism. It's a very powerful seduction in some ways, but it's never brought me to the point where I say, perhaps that's for me.
I've come to realise that it doesn't make me any less Christian to fully acknowledge and embrace the Jewish roots of Christianity. And I'm certainly intrigued by some of the genius in the Jewish rituals. I'm not blinded, though, to the very real points of difference between the two faiths. But as a Catholic, I remain deeply enriched by all that is Jewish. Next week on Compass, the interview that had everyone talking when it went to air in the UK.
Suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say?
I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil.
The Meaning of Life with Stephen Fry. That's next on Compass. I'll see you then.